Very happy he's here today. So will you please welcome Dr. Goldberg?
So good morning, and I want to thank Mrs. Reagan for inviting me in. It's a pleasure to be here, a pleasure to be connected with her after a lot of years. And she asked me to talk to you about covenant and hesed. And we're going to get to that shortly, but I want to start out just with a little bit of context for the way that I want to approach it. We're going to take a look at covenant and hesed in a comparative perspective, so looking a little bit at two different religions that are related to each other, Judaism and Christianity, and get a sense of how they both come together around covenant. And so the first thing that we really need to think about is the source that we can look to find information. And the primary source, of course, is the Bible. But when shifting between a Jewish perspective and a Christian perspective, we need to also realize, or we need to also sometimes be able to step sort of outside and take a third-party perspective and be kind of outsiders looking in. And so the first thing that we need to do is think about how Jews and Christians think about the Bible, because it's not the same. Obviously, for Christianity, there are two major sections to the Bible, the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the world of Judaism, there is no New Testament, and it makes no sense to call the Old Testament the Old Testament, since there is no New Testament. So from a more neutral perspective, what we can speak about is the Hebrew Bible. When we're referring to what you would normally call the Old Testament. And we can call it the Hebrew Bible because most of it is in Hebrew. The book of Daniel is actually partially in Aramaic, and a few other books are entirely in Aramaic. And the book of Genesis has 2 Aramaic words in it. So there are a couple of languages that appear in the text. But what I also want to do quickly is just show you that for Jews, they don't refer to the Old Testament. They also don't call those books that they refer to as the Bible the Hebrew Bible, but instead they use an acronym in Hebrew, and that acronym is Tanakh. And the word Tanakh encapsulates the 3 sections of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. So how many of you even knew that there were 3 different sections in the Old Testament? Okay, so that's already news. So the first of those sections, and I'm going to give you the Hebrew names and then we'll talk about what they mean. The first of those sections is the Torah. The second section is called Nevi'im. And the third section is called Tuvim. You all heard the word Torah before? Okay. Anyone have any clue what it means? Do you know which books of the Bible it refers to?
Take a guess.
Take a guess. Throw something out. What do you think? It is the first section, so if you open up a Bible, where does it start?
The stories of creation.
Good, the stories of creation, or the book of Genesis. So the book of Genesis is the first of 5 books that are also referred to as the 5 books of Moses, because even though Moses doesn't appear in the book of Genesis, there are traditions that suggest that Moses actually wrote these 5 books, though they were dictated to him by God. He didn't just write them himself. And so those first 5 books, which are, who knows, Genesis, what's next? Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Good. Those 5 books constitute the Torah. And the word Torah comes from the Hebrew word meaning to teach, and so it means teachings. Or teaching, singular. So Mrs. Reagan, if we were speaking about her in Hebrew, we would say that she is your morah, very similar to Torah. This does not
Yeah,
appear
there's
to be-
certain quadrants on that board that get kind of funky. So
Okay.
there's
well,
nothing you can do about it.
All right. Bear with me. M-O-R-A-H. So if you go into an Israeli school, they talk about their morah or their moreh. Morah would be a female teacher, moreh would be a male teacher. So it's the same root as Torah, meaning teaching. So we already talked then about what those 5 books are. The next section of books are called the books of the prophets, or the Nevi'im. So what do you think some of the books might be that are included in that section? Who do you think of as being classical prophets? Come on, give it a try.
Remember who we read the other day? Do you remember? No. Take a guess.
Good.
Good.
Ezekiel is one. He's one of the, what are called the great. There are 3 prophets called the greater prophets, and then there's 12 called the minor prophets. The greater prophets, their books tend to be 30, 40, 50, 60 chapters in length. The minor prophets may only be 1 chapter, 2 chapters, maybe up to about 9 chapters in length. So who else? Who goes with Ezekiel? Some other great names. One starts with an I. Isaiah. And then there's a J. Jeremiah. You see, you do know. You're just shy. So don't be shy today. So Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are the 3 greater prophets. Some of the minor prophets are folks like Habakkuk and Micha and Joel and Obadiah and Zechariah. I use Hebrew pronunciations for their names, so they might not quite sound Zechariah. You've probably heard Zechariah. Micha, you've probably heard Micah. So those are some of the books of prophets, and those are the books of prophets that are attributed to particular prophets, and they tell their own story of God calling them and their mission to the people of Israel to keep Israel on God's path, or get Israel back on God's path, or tell Israel that bad things are going to happen because Israel is refusing to walk in God's ways. Prior to those books in the prophets, there's a few other books that tell the history of the kingdom of Israel. And so the first of those books is the book of Joshua, which actually tells the story of the conquest of Canaan or Canaan, which is then followed by the 2 books of Samuel. Samuel was another prophet who initially installed the first king in Israel. And then actually deposed that king because Saul didn't do what God wanted. And then the book of Kings tells the story of kings like David and Solomon and their children. And I skipped over the book of Judges, which comes after Joshua. And so those books really tell kind of a historical tale. And then the other prophetic books are prophetic images. Much of them are very poetic. It sounds like you've read some of that, so you may have a little bit of a feel for what that's like. It's kind of difficult literature. You have to tease out what are they trying to say, and what do we make of it. The third section of the Hebrew Bible, or the Tanakh, are the Ketuvim, which are the writings. So we've already named a bunch of books. What are some books left over that you think would then be part of the writings? Does anyone know which book of the Bible is probably the most used by Christians as well as Jews in the context of prayer? Psalms, exactly. Probably the most read book of the entire Tanakh is the book of Psalms. So that comes from the section called the writings. The book of Job is in the writings. There are 5 scrolls in the writings that are the story of Esther, of Ruth, the Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, and Lamentations are all included in the writings. Then there are 2 historical books at the end of the writings called Chronicles 1 and 2, which go back over the history of the kingdoms of Israel. So that, in a nutshell, is Tanakh, is the Hebrew Bible, or what you usually refer to as the Old Testament. And according to Catholic teaching, the Old Testament was then superseded or completed by the New Testament. So let's focus for a moment on this key word that we're talking about, which will help us come into the question of what covenant is, and that's the word testament. Why do we refer to these books, at least in Christian tradition, as testament? What is a testament? Anyone know? Yeah.
Maybe like people give like testaments of their faith, so like a proclamation kind of?
Good, so like a proclamation of faith, or what's a word that sounds a little like testament that could also be used in that context? Testimony. Good. And who gives testimony? In court, for example. Not the judge. The witnesses. Excellent. So the witness gives testimony. So to give testimony is to be a witness to something. So why do you think Christians might refer to the Bible as a testament, as something that gives witness to something?
Kind of like our faith.
Good, proof of our faith. So what does the Bible give testimony to or witness to?
God.
And more specifically, at least for Christians, the life of Jesus. Because the New Testament uses the Old Testament to show how the Old Testament proves that Jesus was going to come and bring salvation. So that's the Catholic and Christian, broader Christian way of reading the Tanakh. Obviously for Jews, they don't read it that way because Jews don't believe that Jesus was God or that Jesus brings salvation. That's the key difference between Judaism and Christianity, if you want to boil it down to a very simple nutshell. So the path to salvation is different. So Christians refer to these books as testaments, as bearing witness. Historically, that actually comes from an accident of translation in the Vulgate. Anyone know what the Vulgate was or is? It's a Latin translation of the Old and New Testament. And when it came to the Hebrew word in the Tanakh, the Hebrew word brit, the translator used testamentum or testament to translate that word. But it's actually a mistranslation, because the Hebrew word brit is used, for example, in contexts where 2 kings come together at the end of a war, for example, and they want to make peace, or they come together and they want to avoid war. So what kind of document would they sign? What kind of agreement would they enter into? A treaty. Good. And so the word brit is used in that context. So the word brit can be understood to mean treaty. It can also be, it's also used in other contexts of agreement, of making agreements between people. But most importantly, for our purposes, the word brit is used in contexts where God, the creator of heaven and earth, is seeking to enter into a relationship with that which he created. You know, in the 17th century, the deists came up with this fascinating idea that God created the world and then stepped back to watch. And God wasn't involved. didn't do anything further in the world. And so Thomas Jefferson, for example, went through his Bible and cut out all the passages that describe God's miracles. It's not part of the story. God doesn't intervene in his world. Is that the view that Catholics have of God's relationship to his world? No. Nor do Jews. So both Jews and Catholics agree that God does intervene in creation and did intervene in creation, and that God sought to enter into a relationship with that which he created. And the word that is used over and over again to describe the nature of that relationship is the word brit. Now, if we translated brit in those contexts as treaty, it just sounds kind of boring, very human. It doesn't really give it any sense of loftiness or being different. And so translators have chosen a more powerful word to think about what brit means in English, and that word is covenant. And in fact, even in legal contexts in American law, the word covenant is also sometimes used to signify an agreement between two parties. So what I want to do is think a little bit with you about covenant and its place in Judaism and Christianity. And one idea that we have in teaching in the university when we teach religion is that if you only know one religion, you don't really know what religion is, because you only have one example. And it helps to study other religions in order to better understand your own. Just like if you study other languages, you generally get to understand how English works better because you have a way to compare it. And so that's the perspective that I want to take today in trying to understand what covenant is, and look at covenant as it emerges in the Hebrew Bible, as it is understood by Jews, and then look at how it is understood by Christians. And so part of what underlies this is the idea that we know historically that Judaism and Christianity are related to each other. They both grow out of the world of the Hebrew Bible, of the Tanakh, and approach it, however, from very different perspectives. Exactly the nature of the relationship between Judaism and Christianity is something that is up to major debate and discussion amongst scholars. It's not simple. Often you'll hear that Christianity grew out of Judaism. It's partially true, but not entirely true. It's more complicated when you dig into it. That's not what we're going to look at. But I do want to make some comparisons just so that we have a feel for what covenant means and how it's different in these two traditions. So before we go further with covenant, though, let me bring in the other major concept that we need to focus on today, which is the concept of hesed. And then I'm actually going to bring in a third concept, which actually does play a role in Christianity, but it doesn't tend to be emphasized, but plays a much more important role in Judaism. So the first concept, of course, that we need to look at is hesed.
Yeah,
Crazy.
it's okay. In certain places, it's just weird. This board is tricky. They gave us the jacked up board.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Well, there we go. If I get the offset right, then it works.
Yeah, it's this one quadrant that's really weird.
So who knows what the word hesed means? Have you done some reading about these ideas yet? No? Yeah.
Well, God's love and mercy for us, and how it's like unconditional.
I'm going to accept God's love. I'm going to reject God's mercy because that's a different term. Okay? So chesed refers to love. It is often translated as loving kindness. Which differentiates it from another word that is used for love in Hebrew, which is the word ahava. So for example, in a prayer that's central to Judaism called the Shema, which is the declaration, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one," that is immediately followed by a commandment that you shall love the Lord your God. And in that context, the word that's used is ahava. That word is usually used in the context of a human being's love for God. The word hesed is often used in the context of God's love for human beings. And I'm sorry, tell me your name.
Megan.
Megan?
Megan.
So Megan, what you added something else to your comment about hesed.
How is unconditional?
Unconditional. So another important idea connected with hesed is that it is unconditional love. What does that mean? Everlasting? Okay. Right? Okay, I see how you're making that connection, but I would say in a way that's another quality of it.
That earlier it's like God will love us unconditionally, meaning that He doesn't need our love back to love us.
Okay, so one aspect of it is that it doesn't have to be reciprocal. We don't have to reciprocate God's love. God loves humanity regardless of how humanity feels about God. Can you expand on that?
No matter what we do or how many mistakes we make, God will love us anyway.
Great, so that's even broader. So you looked at one piece and that broadens it out. No matter what human beings do, God will love human beings. God seeks relationship with His creation regardless of what His creations do in return. I saw a few more hands up. Megan?
Isn't it true also that like we can't earn His love, but we also can't do anything to take away? It's just like there.
Good, and this is where we start to get into some differences in some ways between Jewish thinking and Christian thinking, and points us in the direction of another concept in Christianity that's important in thinking about hesed. So what Megan said is that human beings can't do anything to earn God's love because it is unconditional. It's not conditioned on any circumstance. But by the same token, nothing human beings can do can take away from God's love. And when Mrs. Reagan first gave me this sort of assignment in terms of what to talk about, see, the student gets to teach or gets to assign things to the teacher now. So that's reciprocity. I was kind of scratching my head at first. I mean, I understood, okay, yes, hesed is definitely an idea that I understand why it would be important in a Catholic context, but I hadn't really thought about it in great depth. And so I was really trying to think through, okay, why hesed? Why did they choose that term to go along with covenant? And I realized it's because hesed also points to a central theological concept in Catholicism as well as other forms of Christianity that goes along with God's unconditional love. Anyone have any ideas what that concept might be? Something that God gives unconditionally to human beings that is an expression of God's love? Yeah.
Forgiveness.
Okay, it relates to forgiveness. That's a piece of the puzzle. Good. And your name?
Chrissy.
Chrissy. You? Yeah.
Grace.
Grace. Excellent. And your name?
Emma.
Emma.
Want a new page?
Not yet. This
Okay.
has to go with hesed still.
Okay.
No, I just want the new board.
As do I. There's been a battle over this crazy smart board. They had it up so high I couldn't reach the top, and then they kept bumping it, and then we couldn't write on it at all. Oh,
Okay.
there's a story behind this board.
It's a long song. Okay. Good. So hesed can be translated in a Catholic context as grace. In a Jewish context, I would translate it as loving kindness or maybe even unconditional love. But grace is a technical term within Catholic thought. So tell me a little bit more about grace.
It's
God's free gift of unconditional love to us.
Good. So grace is God's free gift of unconditional love for us. And you really pulled that all together in a very nice package, to which I can't add a thing. So we've covered then these different ideas. So at its core, grace involves God's love. It's unconditional. It is a gift that God gives. So it is central to the way in which God relates to his creations. And in particular, in the Catholic understanding, it plays a vital role. In the context of Judaism, it is God's loving kindness. God does love humanity unconditionally, but God chooses to relate to humanity a little bit differently than he does in Christianity, and we'll get to that shortly. I do want to introduce another term that relates to that, though, and a term that, again, I think is more present than Christians tend to think in Christianity, but in Judaism is really the term that we talk about even more than God's love, because it's something that Jews deal with every day. And in Hebrew, the term is din. There. Which means judgment. So in a sense, if we have hesed on one side, if we have God's love on one side, then we have din, or judgment, on the other side. There is God's unconditional love, but at the same time, God does judge his creations as well. Can anyone think of ways in a Catholic understanding where judgment comes into play? Okay, good. So the idea in Revelation is that there's going to be a judgment day. And what's that all about? In a nutshell.
Deciding if we live our life to live like God wanted us to, or to go to heaven or to hell.
Okay, good. So there is some kind of fate that awaits us. And so there are ideas about being judged in the future based on your actions in this life, even though there is divine grace. So how does grace sort of go together with judgment then? Because how can can the two really go together?
When we make mistakes, that can be judged. By having God's grace, we can also be forgiven.
Excellent. So grace becomes kind of the way out when there is judgment. And in effect, the judgment is already predetermined. But nonetheless, judgment takes place. So what's the fundamental problem, theologically, that grace comes to solve for Catholics? Why do you need divine grace? Why not just have good people? Maybe. Good, because there's original sin. So there's an idea in Catholicism, what does original sin mean? Well, first, what marks the occurrence of original sin? Where does it come from, biblically?
Adam and Eve.
Good, the story of Adam and Eve and what happened with Adam and Eve that leads to original sin.
When Adam ate from the or no, Eve ate from Adam and Eve ate from the tree.
Good. So when Eve ate from the tree, she was tricked by the serpent into eating from the tree, and then she gives it to Adam too. And that brings death and a whole slew of other things into the world. And in the Catholic understanding, it also brings about original sin. And what's the implication of original sin? Why is that a problem that requires grace? What does original sin mean for all human beings?
Come on, you guys know. Come on. someone
your
besides
hand
them?
up, or were you? You?
Oh, I was like,
It means that come back to me. I'm just gathering.
Anyway, Emma?
Not everything is free will.
It does have something to do with free will.
So because we have free will, we can choose to sin and disobey God. But going back to the grace thing, that can also help us be forgiven.
Right. But in fact, original sin pushes back against free will in a certain way. It actually reduces free will. Yeah.
So since we're all born with original sin, like we don't have the choice of whether we are born with it. So does that have something like?
Yes, absolutely. So the idea behind original sin is that every person at birth is already a sinner. You haven't done anything yet, but you're already a sinner.
I would say it damages our human nature. I wouldn't say
Okay.
the sin always has to be freely chosen. So I'd say we're damaged.
Okay. Damaged goods.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
sad, but that's the Catholic theology.
Right. So there's already an imperfection, something that needs to be overcome, and are human beings capable of overcoming that by themselves? No. And so that's where grace comes into the picture, and more particularly then what becomes the sin, what is the sign of God's grace? Who comes to solve the problem for man? Jesus. Okay. So Jesus is the second Adam. Good. The first Adam messed it up, and Jesus comes to set things straight. So for Catholicism, we can say that Christianity emphasizes God's love for humanity as expressed through the sacrifice of Jesus to atone for original sin. And faith in Jesus, together with participation in the sacraments of the Church, provides the path to salvation for every human. Paul taught, however, that Jesus was the fulfillment of the covenant found in the Old Testament. So he says very explicitly that Jesus didn't come to overthrow the covenant that God made with Israel, but rather to fulfill that covenant, which transforms that covenant. So for Christianity, the fundamental problem is original sin, that human beings are somehow damaged from the get-go, and they can't rescue themselves from that situation. It's the death of Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus, that offers the path to overcoming it. And then a Catholic has to not only have faith in Jesus, but participate in the sacraments of the Church in order to, in fact, achieve salvation. So that becomes the path to salvation, and so that we could say that in a way that lays out the covenantal relationship. So the important point here in terms of covenant is that God seeks to enter into a relationship with his creations, and the means by which he does that is through covenant, through making agreements. And so what I just gave in brief terms is a summary of that covenant as it's understood in Catholicism. In Judaism, we find a somewhat different picture. Judaism, as I said earlier, Judaism and Jews reject the idea that Jesus was the Messiah or God's Son or God or any of that. Some Jews are willing to embrace that historically a person named Jesus who lived something like the life he lived exists. Other Jews say no, the whole thing is embrace that historically that's a person named discussion we did something like that community exists. But in terms of Judaism's understanding of its relationship to God, Judaism emphasizes God's love for humanity as expressed through God's gift of commandments to a particular family within the human community, namely Israel. As expressed through God's gift. And so there's a difference in emphasis in Judaism and Catholicism. What does the word Catholic? Namely Israel. Universal. So Catholicism views itself as the universal religion, as a religion for all humankind, and there is no salvation without it. Judaism takes a very different approach and says that the commandments that God gave to the Jewish people are only for the Jewish people. They are a gift to the Jewish people. And Judaism, therefore, is the religion of the Jewish people. And then through the Jewish people, the rest of the world can enter into a relationship with God. So if you go to chapter 12 in the book of Genesis, God comes to Abraham and says a rather remarkable thing to Abraham. He says, leave your country, leave your father's house, leave behind everything that you knew, and go to a land that I'm going to show you. And he doesn't even tell him where that is, just go to a land I'm going to show you. Well, if someone came to you today and said that to you, what would your first reaction be? I see rejection up here. No. Yeah.
I would feel like freaked out.
Feel pretty freaked out. You think you would do it? Well, the amazing thing is a few verses later it says that Abraham just got up and did it. No questions, no conversation, no second thoughts, no challenge. He gets up and he goes. And God makes a promise to Abraham. And the promise that he makes to Abraham is that Abraham is going to be the father of a great nation, and that those who curse that nation are going to be cursed, and those who bless that nation are going to be blessed. So God now picks one family from among humanity and focuses on that family as a path for the rest of the world to achieve salvation. If you look at the earlier books, of the first 11 books of Genesis, God took a different approach to trying to enter into a relationship with humanity. In those 11 books, God tries to relate to humanity as a whole. So he creates Adam and Eve. They're the very first human beings, thus in a sense they stand for all human beings. What does God do with Adam and Eve? He puts them in the garden and he gives them a commandment. Don't eat the fruit of this one tree. And by the way, how many of you think that fruit was an apple? Raise your hands high. Don't be shy. Okay. You can thank Milton in the 17th century for that. There were no apples in the ancient Near East, and the Hebrew Bible just says it was a fruit. We don't know what fruit. So just a little bit of Bible trivia for you. So God put Adam and Eve in the garden. How did that go? His attempt to enter into a covenantal relationship with them. Not too well, right? I mean, in the Catholic view, it leads to original sin. Even in the Jewish view, it does lead to things going very wrong, even though Judaism doesn't have a notion of original sin. In Jewish teaching, there's an idea that every person is an Adam for themselves. Every person has the free choice, is born without any damage, is born perfect, and then their own choices determine what happens over the course of their lives. But things go wrong. Does anything go right in those first 11 chapters? How about after Adam? What happens? Do human beings show themselves to be loving and wonderful? No. We have the story of 10 generations who are horrible to one another. They engage in war and bloodshed of all sorts, treat each other badly, and eventually, amongst much regret, what does God do? Floods the earth. He destroys his entire creation. Except for Noah and the animals that go on the ark. After Noah comes off the ark, what's the first thing he does? Remember? Plants a vineyard and gets drunk. And then one of his sons comes and finds him in a very awkward position. There's probably some kind of sexual transgression. It's hard to know. So things immediately go wrong again. And then we have the story of the Tower of Babel. What happened with the Tower of Babel?
They came to the tower, and then didn't they, God made them all speak different languages, so they couldn't finish it because no one understood each other.
Right. So what was the idea of building this tower? What do you think?
Oh, they're trying to get to heaven. right?
Good, they're trying to get to heaven. So you could be trying to get to heaven for one of two reasons, right? You could want to get to heaven because you want to be with God and be able to, pray to your king up close and personal in his home, right? What's another reason you could want to get to heaven? To challenge God. Look how great we are. You think you're so wonderful up here in heaven. We can build this tower and come up to heaven and dethrone you. So which do you think God thought was the case? The second one. So God changes their languages. So a guy asks for a hammer and gets handed a banana. They can't finish building the tower. And then God spreads them to the corners of the earth. So of course this story also helps explain why we have a lot of languages and why human beings live all over the earth and not just around the place where Adam and Eve lived. But again, it shows a failure on the human beings' part at least in God's attempt to relate to human beings. And in each of these stories, the attempted relationship is universal. God tries to relate to all of humanity. Adam is the first man, so if God has a relationship with Adam, through that he relates to the rest of humanity. Noah is effectively, and his family are the survivors of the flood. Through them, God can enter into a relationship with all of humanity. And then with the Tower of Babel, we see humanity choose the wrong path in trying to relate to God. In fact, it seems like maybe they want to overthrow God, though it is important to note that the biblical text never explicitly says that, so that's an inference that we're making based on God's response. So then when God comes to Abraham, he basically is saying, okay, attempts to relate to all of humanity in a universalistic manner didn't work, so instead I'm going to relate to humanity through one individual and ultimately through one family and then through one nation. And so then God puts forth this idea that those who bless Abraham and the nation that comes from him will be blessed. Those that curse Abraham and the nation that comes from Abraham will be cursed. Can you see a Christian reading of that story? The Jewish reading says, well, this is Abraham and his family. And that's what the biblical story says. Can you see how that might play itself out in Christianity? Who takes the place of Abraham? Jesus. If you have faith in Jesus, that's part of the path to salvation, right? If you don't, you're not going to find salvation. So the story is that story is transformed in the Christian reading of the story. So Judaism is ultimately the religion of a particular people rather than a religion for the whole world. However, Judaism doesn't deny the universalistic aspect. It basically says that through the relationship to Israel, the rest of the world can find salvation. So in the book of Exodus, chapter 19, God refers to Israel as Mamlechet Kohanim, a nation of priests. What's the role of a priest? Think about it even in the Catholic model. What is the role of a priest? I'm sorry? Part of it's to teach about God, but think about it more in terms of salvation. What is a priest's job in the church? I'm sorry?
To get people to heaven.
How?
Confession.
Hmm?
Confession.
Confession is one example of the how. There's 6 more.
Oh, sacraments.
Good. So the priests administer the sacraments, right? So they are the intermediaries between the Catholic community and God, between the church and God. Or actually, they are the church, so I don't think that statement quite works. But they are the intermediaries. So in the same way, what God is saying of the nation of Israel is that as a nation, Israel functions as the intermediaries between the rest of humanity and God. Okay? So the covenant the way that Israel approaches, or that Jews approach covenant, is very different from the Christian approach, although Judaism historically, largely for political reasons, has downplayed the idea that the Jewish community are the intermediaries for the rest of the world to God. It's hard when you don't have political power to make that idea stick. So for Judaism, the way in which God expresses his love for humanity is through the gift of commandments. And the Jewish people were given 613 commandments. Anyone know how many commandments in Jewish teaching were given to the rest of the world? And it's not 10. Seven. There's an idea in Jewish teaching that God gave 7 commandments to Noah, and that those commandments apply to all of humanity. And then the 613 commandments that God gave to Israel apply specifically to Israel. And so in that way, the rest of humanity also does participate in God's love, is an object of God's love, has a way to enter into relationship with God. Any questions? So now let's explore this idea of covenant in more depth.
Oh, here, oh, there it works. Good.
Not always?
No, it's the story of my life.
Okay. Okay. So then what is a covenant? A promise is one form of covenant, so let's think a little more broadly. Good, so it's an agreement between two people, or we could say more generically between two parties, since we could have groups of people as well. So covenant combine that with my bad handwriting, and can anyone even read it? Okay. So a covenant is an agreement between two parties. And really there are two types of covenants that appear in the Hebrew Bible. And the first type of covenant that appears is a unilateral covenant. And the second type is a bilateral.
Remember the other day when I was telling you your book had a problem with the way they were defining covenant? This is what it is. They only define it in one way, and that's problematic.
So which way did they define it? So I know what they've read.
They just, it's unilateral.
Unilateral. Okay. And the fact is that in modern law, the difference between unilateral and bilateral covenants has been virtually erased because they are difficult to differentiate between. But we are going to make that differentiation because it is helpful to understand what's happening with covenant in the Hebrew Bible and what's happening with covenant in terms of the Jewish conception of covenant and Christian conception of covenant. So it'll help us understand the relationship between these two traditions. So what do you think a unilateral covenant is as an agreement between two parties?
It's a one-sided agreement.
Okay, it's a one-sided agreement. So what would that look like?
Where one party agrees and the other one doesn't.
Close, but not quite.
Oh.
In a unilateral covenant, one party makes a promise to the other party. The other party can simply ignore the promise, and perhaps the promise will be fulfilled anyway. Or, at least in a legal context, the party that the promise is made to could show by some action on their part, but not by any agreement, that they're participating in the covenant, and therefore the party that made the promise is obligated to keep the promise. Does that make sense? I know it's a little hard to follow. Let's look at one brief example. If you take out your Bibles, which looks like you've all got under your seats. If you turn to Genesis chapter 2, verse 15. I'm going to ask someone to read verses 15 to 17. So I have a different translation than you do. Go ahead. And your name?
Alexis.
Alexis.
The Lord God then took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and care for it. The Lord God gave the man this order: "You are free to eat from any of the trees of the garden, except the tree of knowledge of good and bad. From that tree you shall not eat. The moment you eat from it, you are surely doomed to die."
Okay. It's always fun to compare different translations. So what's in the first verse here? What's the setting of this scene? It's the Garden of Eden, and what does God do? Good. So he places Adam in the garden. Eve hasn't been created yet. So this is just Adam on his own. He places him in the garden. Why? Good. To cultivate and care for the garden. So it seems that in God's mind, he puts Adam in the garden, and the purpose of putting him there is to cultivate and care for the garden. Does Adam know that? Based just on what it says in the verse. No. Because God doesn't tell him, does he? It just tells him, it tells us God's intention, but God never tells Adam anything about his intention. What does God tell? And in fact, it's important to emphasize, I think there the word was interesting, but the word really is he commanded Adam. So what does he command Adam to do? Emma.
That he was free to eat any of the fruits of the trees except for the tree of knowledge, and that if he did, he would be doomed to die.
Okay, good. So there's two parts to that commandment, right? The first part is you can eat any fruit of the garden that you want. The second part is a condition that restricts the first part. And the restriction is any fruit of the garden that you want except the fruit of this one tree. And the consequence for eating the fruit of that tree is, the way that it actually says it literally in Hebrew, is on the day that you eat of it, you will die. None of the translators, for some reason, actually translated that literally. It, of course, leaves open questions, because does Adam die the moment he eats of the fruit of the tree? No. So that's a big exegetical problem, isn't it? Okay, so what do we have here? God puts Adam in the garden for a purpose, to cultivate the garden. But then he simply commands Adam about being in the garden. You can do what you want. You can eat anything that you want, but don't eat from the fruit of this tree. So how does this work as a covenant? Good, it's a unilateral covenant. How so?
Because Adam doesn't agree to it.
Good, so there's no reciprocity. Adam does not ever say, sure, I'll do that. In fact, is Adam in fact commanded really to do anything? Not so much. He's given permission in the form of a command. But he doesn't necessarily have to eat of the fruit if he doesn't want. Now, what's surprising about this commandment, given that we are told that God put Adam in the garden to take care of the garden? God never commands Adam to take care of the garden, does he? So there's just a gift. You have this garden. So that's a free gift. That's unilateral. That's one way. God then says, eat whatever you want in the garden. In fact, in the form of a command. Because what would happen if Adam didn't eat the fruit of the garden? He'd die. And then we'd be at the bad consequence anyway, wouldn't we? So that really wouldn't make sense. So God puts him in the garden, makes a promise to him. You can eat anything of the garden that you want, but except for the fruit of this one tree. If you eat from that fruit, you'll die. Who here has an obligation to do anything?
Oh, we have to go to school every day.
In this verse, sorry. That was good. In this verse, who is obligated to take an action?
No one.
Adam? What obligation does Adam have?
Well, one might have to.
Good. He has no obligation. God doesn't say to him, here's the garden, you have to take care of it. He says to him, he just says to him, you've got all this wonderful fruit around you. Eat as much as you want, except for from that tree. Let's look at another example in chapter 9. Here you'll see how God gets the idea, or how Jews get the idea that there are 7 commandments that all humanity has to follow, even though actually in this text there's only 5 of those 7. So who would like to read chapter 9, going from verse 1 through verse 7? Go ahead.
So starting with the covenant with Noah.
Yeah. That's just a heading that they've added, but go ahead.
God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fertile and multiply and fill the earth. Dread fear of you shall come upon all the animals of the earth and all the birds of the air, upon all the creatures that move about on the ground and all the fishes on the sea. Into your power they are delivered. Every creature that is alive shall be yours to eat. I gave them all to you, as I did green plants. Only flesh with its lifeblood, still you shall not eat. For your own lifeblood too. I will demand an accounting. From every animal I will demand it. And from man, in regard to his fellow man, I will demand an accounting for human life. If anyone sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God has man been made. Be fertile then and multiply. Abound on earth and subdue it.
Okay. So what do we have here in terms of a covenant? Do we even have a covenant?
Well, God promises Noah that he'll be fertile and have lots of sons if he doesn't do the things that he lists, kind of. So it gives him obligation.
Good. So there's an interesting wrinkle here, because it starts out by saying that God blessed Noah and his sons. So when you think of a blessing, don't you normally think of something like, may you be fertile and increase. May you live a good long life. We normally think of that as a blessing, wouldn't we? But instead here, the blessing takes the form of a commandment. Be fertile and increase. And so the blessing is now turned into an obligation that is imposed on man. Although we'll have to ask about that obligation shortly. We also have a pattern here that fits with the pattern that we saw with Adam in the garden. Adam was commanded, you can eat anything you want except from that tree. Adam was a vegetarian. Noah is told, the animals on the earth are going to fear you. You can eat any of them, except for certain ones. or except in a certain way. You must not, however, eat flesh with its lifeblood in it. So this comes to, I mean, the rabbis understand, the Jewish teachers understand this to mean you can't rip a limb from a living animal and eat it. So you can eat all flesh, but you can only eat it in appropriate ways, and then don't murder. Are there any consequences stated here for not doing any of these things? No.
It says that on 6, it says, if anyone sheds the blood of man, by man his blood shall be shed. So basically, if you do this, then your life will be risky.
Good. So in the case of murder, at least, we're given a consequence. Obviously, this becomes a proof text for those who believe that capital punishment is okay. And it's presented as a pretty little poem. In the Hebrew, it's 3 Hebrew words, and you read them one way. They're written shvoch dam ha'adam. So whoever sheds the blood of man, ba'adam damo yishafech. The same words, simply reversed. By man shall his blood be shed. So there is a consequence, at least at the hands of man. Is God obligated to any action in relationship to these commandments? None whatsoever. Megan's nodding her head, so I'll take that as an answer. So there is no obligation on God. And other than for murder, no consequences are given for breaking these commandments. So there's at least a notion, some notion of consequence comes into play here. Now, continue reading. Your name again?
Kiara.
Kiara.
So from 8 on to...
Yeah, I think if you just read 8 through 11, that'll be enough to give us the idea.
God said to Noah and to his sons with him, see, I am now establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that was with you, all the birds and the various tame and wild animals that were with you and came out of the ark. I will establish my covenant with you, that will never again shall all bodily creatures be destroyed by the waters of a flood. There shall not be another flood to devastate the earth. Or flood, sorry.
Is anyone obligated by these words? Is anyone required to do or not do something? God. So how does that play that out? What is God saying here?
He's saying that he won't send a flood like that again.
Right. So God says, I will never destroy the earth by a flood again. So by the way, nuclear Armageddon is on us, not God. So it doesn't mean the earth can't be destroyed, but it is a promise by God, a unilateral. He describes this explicitly as a covenant. This is a unilateral covenant that God makes with humanity, that he will never destroy the world again. So what do the commandments that come before that have to do with anything? How do they fit into this covenant? What's the relationship between those commandments and this covenant?
Well, the ones in the first part had to do with Noah, and the other ones had to do, or the not flooding the earth had to do with God, so they each had their own obligations for it.
Okay, but is God obligated to do anything in response to Noah's breaking the commandments that he was given? It appears not. Now, it appears that if Noah doesn't do them, maybe he won't have blessing. So maybe on a subtle level, but that doesn't really come from God. So the point, and then what is God promising?
Not flood the earth.
To not flood the earth. Why did God flood the earth before?
They were not happy with their situation.
Why not? Because they were doing everything he just commanded them not to do. Okay? But, even though he basically says, be fruitful and multiply, you can eat the animals, but don't mistreat the animals and don't kill each other. God then says, even if you go and do all of that stuff I just said not to do, I still promise from now and until eternity that I will never destroy the earth again. It's your choice. You can be blessed by living in this way that I'm giving you guidance for, or you can choose the path of curse. Remember in Deuteronomy, we have the Israelites standing on two mountains, and God says, I have set before you this day the blessing and the curse, life and death. Choose life. Choose the blessing. So the choice exists for man of being blessed or being cursed. But that's innate to man's existence in the earth. God's promise is even if you choose the path of being cursed and you go against all of these commandments, I won't destroy the world again. That's the obligation that God is taking on himself. That's the unilateral covenant. Yes, God is recommending a certain way of life. But at the end of the day, he's really not requiring that man follow suit. And so we see that again in a few other contexts. If you look at Genesis 17. We'd like to read starting at verse 1 and going to verse 8.
When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God, the Almighty. Walk in my presence and be blameless. Between you and me, I will establish my covenant, and I will multiply you exceedingly. When Abram prospered...
Actually, let's just stop right there for a moment, because it's enough to chew on. What kind of covenant do we see there? How so?
We will establish the covenant on the same division as Sinai, and has to do something.
Good. And so far in this passage, there isn't, is there? So far, it looks like a unilateral covenant, doesn't it? But again, it's similar to what we just saw with Noah, where God does recommend a certain path to Avram. He says, I am El Shaddai, walk in my ways and be blameless. I know my translation is a little different than yours. I will establish my covenant between you, me and you, and I will make you exceedingly numerous. Now the question is whether, even if Abraham does make the choice of walking in God's ways, is God simply making a promise? And in other passages, God just promises Avram that pretty much no matter what you do, I'm going to help you. So here we start seeing the beginnings of an opening to a bilateral covenant, because God is now seems to be requiring something of Avram in order to get the reward, in order to get becoming a great nation. And actually just be, you said till 12:55? 53. Oh, okay, so like 2 minutes, got it. So we won't read the next part. But in the next part, God says to Avram, the sign of my covenant is going to be circumcision, that you're going to effectively sign this covenant in blood on the male body. And that's how but again, it's not really bilateral, because it's just a way of showing...
Teachers, please excuse interruption.
And in chapter 24, a description of Moses and his entourage going up to Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments. In response to the reception of the Ten Commandments, Israel says, we will do and we will understand. So the doing comes first, the understanding comes from the doing. But now we have moved to a fully bilateral covenant in which God has said, this is what you need to do, and there are some rewards and punishments for doing it or not doing it. And Israel has turned around and taken up their part and said, well, yes, we are obligated by this. We have to do this. And now it is a bilateral covenant. If you think through the words of the prayer that you just said, what kind of covenant was that? A unilateral covenant. And I would suggest that if you want to understand the difference between Judaism and Christianity, you have to understand that while Judaism embraces a form of unilateral covenant that says that yes, one day God will bring the Savior, and Israel will be the priests unto the nations, in the meantime, what you need to do to make that happen is keep the bilateral covenant that you have agreed to and accepted. Whereas the Catholic covenant, although it does require the sacraments, ultimately the sacraments are an expression of faith in Jesus, and it is a unilateral covenant in which you are accepting God's salvation and recognizing that the only way to your salvation is to throw yourself on God's love and God's hesed. Thank you.
You're excused.